It's very easy to get all the groups who settled in North America mixed up, so we're going to take a few minutes and clear things up. These were the three original British colonies. First, you have Jamestown, which was settled in 1607. Then we move on to the Plymouth Plantation Colony. Would have been spelled with an I back then. That was in 1620. And then the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which was 10 years after Plymouth in 1630. And we're going to leave out the failed colony of Roanoke, which was settled in 1585, I believe. And we're going to leave them out because it failed. We generally only talk about these three because they succeeded, and so they're the ones that the United States was actually built upon. And they were taking massive risks when starting their colonies, especially Jamestown. Jamestown and Plymouth both, but really Jamestown being the first, they were pretty much all alone in their endeavor. The Massachusetts Bay Colony, on the other hand, they settled right next to the Plymouth Colony 10 years after the Plymouth Colony. So Plymouth Colony had been there for a decade and was doing very well when Massachusetts Bay Colony came in and literally settled on their border. So they had the advantages of people that spoke the same language. They would have had people to trade with right away, right off the bat. People they could learn from, learn planting techniques and things like that, learn about the land, and learn from their successes and also their mistakes. So you can see how that would make things significantly easier for Massachusetts Bay Colony than for Plymouth and Jamestown at the time. We also tend to focus on these three because, as opposed to any of the other ones that came after, because it is from them that we see the development of many of the institutions and values that became foundational to the United States. The settlers at Jamestown were not part of any one particular organization or religion. They were made up of a lot of different people, a lot of different adventurers and entrepreneurs. And they were located down here. Let's go to a map. Jamestown was located on the eastern shore of what is now Virginia. They would have settled first somewhere in here. This is the inlet of the James River. This is the James River, which of course was named after King James, as was Jamestown. So that would have been started somewhere around there. Plymouth Colony was next, and they would have initially landed somewhere on this strip of land that juts out from Massachusetts. That would have been their first landing spot. And then after a month or so, they moved inland to the land proper and set up what is now Plymouth Town, the town of Plymouth today. And eventually this whole thing would become the Plymouth Plantation Colony. Now, they were supposed to settle in Virginia. Their charter was for Virginia, but they didn't end up exactly where they had planned. Sailing across the world was not an exact science. So they settled where they landed. You have to remember, though, that this entire area, pretty much the entire coast of North America, was considered Virginia by the British. So the Plymouth Colony was settled by the people that we have come to know today as the Pilgrims, although that was a name that wouldn't be attached to them until many years later, possibly as late as 1800. But that's what we call them now. And remember that Pilgrims is just a name, a nickname, actually, that was given to this group of people who were escaping religious persecution in England. And they pilgrimaged across the ocean to set up a new religious society. So we should make sure we always pay attention to root words. Pilgrimaged, pilgrims, that's where the name comes from. Then, like I said, the Massachusetts Bay Colony settled in here, right on the border of the Plymouth Colony, just a little bit more inland. And these colonies would have expanded, and eventually the Plymouth Colony was absorbed into the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and they both become what is today Massachusetts. The people who settled the Massachusetts Bay Colony were Puritans. Those who settled the Plymouth Colony, the Pilgrims, were also Puritans. What? That doesn't sound right at all, Mr. G. Let me explain. So, Puritan is the name given to their particular sect of Christianity. Okay, so these two groups are a sect of Christianity. And remember, Pilgrim is just a nickname for this one group of Puritans. Okay, so let's go into this. I'm going to try and make this as simple as possible. First, we had the Catholic Church, sometimes referred to as the Roman Catholic Church, but that does not mean that the Romans started or created the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church was instituted by Jesus himself and then advanced by his disciples. It's true that when it became the official religion of the Roman Empire, that it began to form into the structure that it has today, but the Romans did not start or initiate it. All right, then Martin Luther comes along. You all remember Martin Luther, right? Martin Luther came along, and the Catholic Church split up into the Catholics and the Protestants, or those who protest. Again, root words, they are definitely your friend. And they protested the Catholic Church. Now, these are all Christians. Okay, so let's keep that in mind. They are all Christians, Protestants and Catholics, coming, of course, from the root word Christ. That would be Jesus Christ, meaning that they all worship Christ. Protestants and Catholics. So they're all Christians. Within the Protestants, there are many, many different groups with just slightly different religious beliefs and practices. Some of them you would recognize, things like Lutherans, that's the obvious one, an R. The Baptists, I'm sure many of you have heard of the Baptists. You would have things like the Methodists and the Pentecostals, the Presbyterians, Shakers, Quakers, Calvinists, Episcopals, Evangelicals, all of them. In fact, there are some estimates that there are upwards of 30,000 different Protestant faiths. The Puritans are one of these groups of Protestants. In almost every place in the world since the establishment of religions, you had to worship the state-sanctioned religion. And you had to do this to receive all of the rights and benefits of citizenship if you were a part of the state-sanctioned religion. If you were not, there was always some kind of punishment or fine. In some places, the punishments for not being a member of the government-sponsored religion were huge, like, execution. I would say that's kind of huge. In some places, they were small punishments and penalties, such as not being able to serve in public office. So no public service. And also, in many places, you would be fined. You would have to pay fines and penalties if you were not part of the state-sanctioned religion. People often refer to this non-believer fine as a tax, but let's be clear. When the government penalizes you for not acting in a certain way, that's called a fine. It's a penalty. When you get a ticket because the government requires you to drive a certain speed, do you come home and say, "Hey, Dad, I have to pay $200 in taxes because I didn't obey the law"? It's no big deal, Pops. It's just taxes. Everybody pays taxes. No. And your dad will not see it that way either. It's a fine, a punishment to coerce you to act a certain way. That's what they're designed to do. To give you a more recent example of this, just like when President Obama made it against the law not to have health insurance, you had to pay a fine or a penalty if you did not have health insurance. You may believe that that fine was just and necessary, and that's fine, but if you didn't obey, you had to pay. That is a fine, regardless of the fact that 5 Supreme Court justices have a different opinion than I do. I can have a different opinion than Supreme Court justices. Supreme Court justices at one point also said that blacks were not allowed to be citizens, that segregation was A-OK, that it was okay for the government to forcibly sterilize people with mental disabilities, and more recently, that the government can prevent people from going to church while at the same time allowing other large gatherings. So they can be wrong, and you can be right. That's a thing that can happen. But I digress. Now, in Europe during this particular time, since the time of Martin Luther, you had to follow the state-sanctioned religion, whatever country you were in, or you were persecuted. You could be hunted down, tortured, imprisoned, fined, executed, banished, etc. England also had its very own Protestant branch of Christianity called the Anglican Church, also known as the Church of England. Good job with the creative naming conventions, Henry VIII. So the Puritans were a group of Protestant Christians within the Anglican Church. Ugh, I know, it's a total mess. All right, back to our main page here. So the Puritans, they were called this because they wanted to purify the Anglican Church, the Church of England. Okay, there's our root words again, purify, Puritans. They believed that it could be fixed from within. Now, I'm not going to get into the particular doctrinal differences that they had with the Anglican Church, but just remember that these people were all Christians. They were all Protestants, and they were all British. So they are 99% similar, but nobody can seem to get along. This is the state of affairs in Europe since the Protestant Reformation. People who are 99% the same in not just their nationalities and ethnic groups, but in all their beliefs, who are all hating and killing each other. Crazy, right? Remember, in England, you had to worship in the Anglican Church. It was mandatory. You even got a fine if you didn't show up to Mass on Sunday. They fined you for that. So you were not allowed to worship any other religion, even one that was 99.9% exactly like it. So these Puritans stayed with the Anglican Church, even though they disagreed with it on some things. They felt like it could be reformed from within. These Puritans, on the other hand, the Pilgrims, they thought that the Anglican Church was a lost cause and couldn't be fixed. Therefore, these Puritans at the time were referred to as Separatists because they wanted to separate from the Church of England, the Anglican Church. So the Pilgrims were a group of Puritans who just wanted to dump the Anglican Church entirely and leave it.
Is that legal?
No, Viceroy Gunray, it was not legal. That's why they had to escape. Okay, to wrap it up, let me just point out that it was not only the Brits who were colonizing North America at this time, but the reason we don't talk about the others is because they were all eventually taken over by the British. So the Dutch settled what is now New York City. So that's New York. That was the Dutch. And they did that in 1624. Then you have the Swedes, who colonized this whole area down here at the mouth of the Hudson River in what is now southern Pennsylvania and southern New Jersey. That was the Swedes in 1638, I believe. but they were conquered by the Dutch. So the Swedes were conquered by the Dutch, and then the British come in and conquered the Dutch subsequently in the year 1664. And in an epic display of poor timing, that very same year, my family, who are Dutch, arrived from Holland in New Amsterdam just in time for the British to take over. Maybe Mr. G's family could have ended up owning Manhattan. That could have happened. You don't know.